Hi everybody, my name is Jessica Barker and I'm a lecturer in medieval art at the Courtauld Institute. It's a real pleasure to welcome you this evening to Shirin Fozzie's Work in Progress talk. I know that we have a very large audience this evening, even though we can't see you all, and also an international one. It's great to see everyone posting there. And kind of amazing to see everyone posting their locations in the chat and to learn there is a place called Normal in Illinois, which I didn't know before. So welcome everybody. Before I introduce Shirin, who we're really delighted to be kind of virtually hosting this evening, I just wanted to highlight a few upcoming medieval events in our programme over the next couple of months because we have a lot going on. So this Friday, the 29th of April, we have an in-person and live streamed medieval postgraduate colloquium. And the theme of that is God is in the details. On the 26th of May, again, both in London and live streamed, we have our annual ICMA lecture, which will be given by Stephen Perkinson, who'll be speaking on the macabre. And then on the 22nd of June, it will be our next work in progress seminar, which again will be both in person and online. And that will be given by Sonia Drimmer, looking at coins and political badges in late medieval England. So Shirin is kicking off a really rich medieval programme over the next couple of months. So as I said, we're really delighted to welcome Shirin virtually this evening. Shirin is an associate professor at the University of Pittsburgh. She was previously a Mellon Fellow at Northwestern, and before that she completed her PhD at Harvard. Shirin's specialism is the visual culture of France and Germany, sort of between the 10th and 12th centuries, with a particular interest in monumental sculpture. She's published a really wide range of articles in edited books and also journals such as Speculum and the Medieval Feminist Forum. She recently co-edited a book on the Boston crucifix, and her wonderful monograph came out last year. I'm just going to show you her book because it's a really beautiful thing. I'll just open a couple of pages as well so you can, this was just a random page, but it's an extremely beautiful one. Here we go, which is entitled Romanesque Tomb Effigies, Death and Redemption in Medieval Europe, 1000 to 1200. And if you haven't read Shirin's book already, I'm about halfway through, and it's an absolutely fabulous and enthralling read, so I really recommend it. Shirin and I actually first met, I think in 2014, we've established at a conference at the Courtauld on Panofsky's tomb sculpture, as she gave a really fabulous paper on the effigies of Rudolf of Swabia and Widukind of Saxony, which she subsequently published in the book of the conference proceedings. And it's just so wonderful to see that research kind of blossom into her book and then kind of continue in her next project, which she'll be speaking about this evening. So the title of her talk, I don't actually have it in front of my eyes, Shirin, I'm really sorry, it's slipped away from me. The title of your talk, oh, here we go, The Guest of the Body. I knew it was a beautiful title that I didn't want to mangle. So today Shirin will be speaking to us about The Guest of the Body, Visualizing Souls in Medieval Europe. Over to you, Shirin.
Thank you, Jessica. Thank you for that really wonderful introduction. I really appreciate it. And I really do feel like we've been having a conversation about tomb sculptures and funerary monuments. And of course, I read your own very beautiful book, cover to cover, not that long ago. So this feels, even though it's a rather large audience, it also feels like a very intimate conversation that we've been having for a while, and hopefully we'll continue to have for years to come. And thank you, really to everybody at the Courtauld for the invitation to speak today, and for everybody in the audience for being here. I'm really very grateful for the opportunity to reflect a little on my current work in progress and to share some ideas with you. So I thought thought we might start with a brief note about my book, which was published almost exactly 1 year ago, because this new project is in many ways a set of ideas and questions that were always lurking in the background of that project, but never quite made it onto the page. From the very beginning, when the first book was still a dissertation, I decided to focus on the effigy as a highly specific genre that emerged in the late 11th century and quickly settled into the format you see on the right, featuring a single open-eyed figure in a frontal position isolated on a framed slab. And I was interested in the idea of a codified type that had a distinctive form and function. But even in those first days, I could see that there was also another closely intertwined thread to follow, one that addresses the extraordinary 12th century monuments that depict images of the rising soul and conversely thematize the body that is left behind. Even as sculptors were first formulating reassuring images like the effigy on the right, depicting the dead in a living state that references both the past life and the expectation of eschatological return, they also formulated a parallel monument type, like the one on the left, that conversely takes up the theme of separation, in which the body is shown dead or dying, but the soul is very much alive, embraced by the angels during the long wait until the end of time. When I set out to write the first book, I imagined that tombs that feature images of the rising soul would perhaps be one of the chapters. But it gradually became clear that there are so many interesting, understudied examples of this iconography across Germany, France, England, and the surrounding regions that the material deserves a separate examination in its own right. And of course, the topic of the rising soul extends far beyond tomb sculpture as well, appearing in ivories, manuscripts, reliquaries, architectural sculpture. But I find that a significant number of these depictions ultimately hinge on the presence of corporeal remains, whether in the tombs of the ordinary dead or the reliquaries of their very special counterparts, the saints. So my talk today is really an open-ended exploration of the topic, but my eventual goal is to look systematically at the iconography of the rising soul and the context within which it appears, not only because there are so many interesting examples, but also because the application of this iconography to objects that were specifically intended for display in dialogue with the body strikes me as an important opportunity to think about the very visceral presence of the dead inside medieval European liturgical spaces. This is, of course, in keeping with medieval art history today. We are drawn more than ever, I think, to contextual discussions that connect objects to the very specific purposes for which they were intended. And in the case of the rising soul, it also allows us to see connections across different media, particularly tomb sculpture, manuscripts, and reliquaries, which are often treated separately in museums and monographs, but were quite clearly in dialogue with one another throughout the Middle Ages. Therefore, the unifying thread among the very different objects in my talk today is not merely iconographic. It is also related to the ways in which images mediate encounters between the living and the dead, particularly as they proliferated across Northern Europe in the 12th and early 13th centuries. So to begin, the consensus from earlier scholarship is that the image of the rising soul was first formulated in Byzantium and emerged with particular force in 10th century ivories that depict the chemosis, or the Dormition of the Virgin. The Dormition itself is a convoluted problem that centers on two conflicting traditions. One, that Mary died, and two, that she ascended bodily to heaven. In the case of Christ, the Gospels explain quite clearly that he died, but then was resurrected, and only after the resurrection did he ascend to heaven. But in Mary's case, there's no intervening moment of resurrection in between death and ascension. And so that led to the formulation of images like this one, which shows Christ appearing from heaven to take his mother's soul. And the soul appears as a swaddled baby. Christ twists his body to hand the soul up to the angels who will carry it to heaven. But rather than gazing up to heaven himself, Christ looks back down at his mother's body with wonderful intensity. And this foreshadows the next moment in the narrative, which is that Mary's body will later be taken up to heaven to join the soul. It also places extraordinary emphasis on the dead body itself, reminding the viewer that the body is still a site of power, even in the absence of the soul. And it is this division of attention that I wish to emphasize, not only in this quite celebrated and I think very familiar example, but also in the development of the iconography in later centuries, in which the departure of the soul amplifies the power of the body as its once and future receptacle. So this particular ivory was brought from Byzantium to Europe by the late 10th century, used for the covers of a gospel book that was associated with the German emperors and the imperial treasury of Aachen, making it one of the most prominent luxury books in all of Europe in its time. So this is therefore a very well-known example, but it represents a larger pattern that was widely repeated as images of the ascent of Mary's soul were absorbed widely into Western European as well as Byzantine visual culture. So rather than examining the origins of this iconography, as many others have done, I wish to turn our attention instead to the proliferation in Northern Europe in the 12th century, when images of the anthropomorphic soul were connected not only to Mary individually or to the generalized souls of the dead in a collective sense, but also to an ever-expanding repertoire of saints. So, as we make this shift from the 10th century to the 12th, I want to emphasize that discussions of the soul that departs are intimately connected with the body that remains. And one of the most vivid depictions of the body of Mary, shown as emphatically dead, appears in the Hunterian Psalter, made in England in the later 12th century. In the upper register, we see the apostles laying Mary's body to rest in a green stone sarcophagus. 4 angels descend from heaven to swing censers over the grave. In the lower register, the number of angels has grown to 14, and they lift her body upward to heaven in a dazzling cloth that they stretch into 14 star-like points. The pictorial plane tips up as if to catapult Mary's body forward out of the page. And the effect is startling, and the whole composition seems designed to focus attention on the body itself. The heavy shroud with an extra band, almost like a blindfold across the face, encases the body to make 2 points emphatically clear. First, that Mary is truly dead, and second, that her body was of its own intrinsic interest, even in this time when the soul was absent. And all of this ties to larger theological questions about the death of the Virgin that were being fiercely debated in Europe in the 12th century. Not only in the written work of male theologians, such as Honorius Augustinensis, but also among women mystics, such as Elizabeth of Schornau, whose visions eventually help establish the belief that Mary's body had ascended physically exactly 40 days after the metaphysical departure of the soul. So it's against these backdrops, so it's against the backdrop of these debates that this earlier 12th century depiction of Mary in the Church of Saint-Lazare in Autun becomes so interesting. Here we find a different theological position, one that seems to insist on Mary's reanimation and prominently integrates the form of the tomb itself into the composition. 2 angels pull Mary's body upwards, hoisting her from her arms as if to yank her through the canopy of the arcosolium-style tomb. And the tomb itself is delicately draped with a textured cloth. Its rounded arch deliberately echoes the forms of a portal or a church, emphasizing the tomb as a liminal space or an opening from the mundane world of the living to the heavenly sphere of the angels. Mary's eyes have been drilled so deeply that we can still glimpse her pupils despite the abraded surface of the face. Her alert expression leaves little doubt that she is experiencing a living ascension. The arms stretch stiffly outward, however, and the asymmetrical posture almost suggests the movement of a marionette. This oddly puppet-like quality not only emphasizes the corporeality of Mary, but also hints at the slow reanimation of a body that has only just been recalled to life. The dramatic flutter of drapery at her feet likewise contrasts with the otherwise flat handling of her garments and the sharp angles of her body. We could compare her form not only to the relatively soft bodies of the angels at either side, but also with this generation of sculpture at Autun more generally, which features many extraordinarily sensitive carvings and fluid forms traditionally associated with the name of Giselbertus. So the unusual configuration of the capital might well be connected to its location at Autun, and more specifically, the dedication of the church to Lazarus, whose relics were housed in a specially constructed tomb in the choir of the church. And the story of Lazarus, who was called forth from the tomb and resurrected by Christ, is one of the key miracle stories in the Gospels. Lazarus not only prefigures Christ's own crucifixion and resurrection, but promises bodily resurrection to his followers, and thus lays the cornerstone for medieval Christian approaches to the body. All of this made the Tomb of Lazarus a particular draw for medieval pilgrims. The monument itself only survives in fragments, but the numerous architectural elements that remain suggest that it too featured an elaborate architectural frame that was understood to mediate between the spaces of the living, the dead, and the resurrected. Though nothing survives of the figure that once represented Lazarus, the three statues on the left represent his sisters, Mary and Martha, as well as St. Andrew. And they once stood alongside the tomb as observers of the divine mystery. Though they were carved fully a generation after the Mary capital, so we're looking at two different moments of the 12th century, they reflect the culmination of a century-long construction project, all of it spurred on by the need to accommodate the pilgrims who flocked to see the relics of Lazarus. And perhaps it is this local context, rather than the abstract debates about body and soul that unfolded across Europe, that inspired the Autun carvers to represent Mary's body reanimated during its ascent. Connecting Mary to bodily resurrection helped reinforce the central mystery of the story of St. Lazarus, and with it, the core appeal of the church that housed its celebrated relics. The Autun Mary is unusual in its insistence on the reunification of body and soul. Its composition plays on the iconography of the departing soul to show her ascension as a whole person. By emphasizing animation as well as ascension, it reminds us that the majority of images of the departure of the soul in the 12th century represent instances in which the body is left behind. And indeed, the most provocative examples appear on tomb sculptures and especially sarcophagus lids. And among the most beautiful of these is the tomb of Hildis of Riesenbeck. In this instance, the inscription on the monument frames the figure in explicitly Marian terms, building a connection to heaven through analogies to Mary herself. And the point here is not merely to emulate Mary in a generalized way as the ideal woman of medieval Christianity, but also to look to her specifically as a model for visualizing the separation and ultimately the reunification of body and soul. If we look closely at the Hildis slab, we see the angel descending from heaven to grasp the soul, his hands covered with cloth. The feet are still anchored in the fiery globe of heaven, but the wing reaches out to touch Hildis gently on her head. The halo of Hildis thus echoes and confirms her direct connection to heaven, a link that was explicitly created through the departure of the soul. We have to imagine this monument not merely as a freestanding stone slab, which is how it is exhibited in Riesenbeck today, but rather as the lid of a sarcophagus that covered the body of the woman herself. The tactile sculpture on the lid gave access not only to the narrative moment of the death of the woman, but also to the pathway to heaven that was opened by the departing soul and remained intimately linked to the body itself. It is images like this that convince me to see 12th century tomb sculptures as public monuments that speak to communal anxieties, rather than individual objects bound up with primarily personal concerns. Hildis is already assured of salvation, and her soul has already been taken to heaven. The concern of the sculpture is not really the salvation of the dead subject, but rather the anxiety of the living audience, who seeks access to divine presence through her tomb. So I'm particularly curious about representations of the soul in monumental art, and specifically funerary monuments. But as I noted at the outset, I'm also interested in expanding what we mean by the term funerary monument, which art history in the model of Erwin Panofsky, and here I'm thinking of the wonderful volume that Jessica edited, but art history in the model of Panofsky has long defined funerary monuments as the objects that engage or encase the body directly, like a sarcophagus or an epitaph. In the field of Romanesque art, however, we would do well to pay attention to how quickly the term falls apart, because we can observe so many different strategies for housing, celebrating, and commemorating the body, which extends, of course, to the relics of the saints, and also for creating monumental art, which encompasses all of the large-scale formats that played a direct role in mediating experiences of the living people who come to visit the dead in their tombs. So with this in mind, we might think of the Gothic role, precisely because its scale and form suggest a manuscript that once functioned in a monumental sense, or at least larger than an object that is only held in the hands of one person. Some of the early scholarship argued that the roll was actually intended as a model for stained glass windows. The association was made largely because of the shape of these roundels. But for technical reasons, the glass scholars have long since pointed out, this doesn't really make sense. And it's actually, I think, far more convincing to imagine that the object could have been used as a kind of picture book at Guthlaic's shrine, made to communicate episodes from his life to pilgrim and offer a pictorial witness to the many miracles associated with his body. And here I'm thinking of recent work by people like Konrad Rudolph, who are thinking quite a lot about the experiences of pilgrimage, but also the many different media of art that could be used to tell these stories. The roll features this striking scene of the death of Guthlac, and we see the saint slumping backwards as two angels pull his soul up. The upper angel has his hands covered with cloth to signify the sacred nature of the soul. His heel rests lightly on an altar that is likewise covered in cloth, linking the sacred events that take place on the altar with the ascent of the soul. It's hard to get good photographs of the entire roll, but one of the keys to looking at these scenes is to imagine the object laid out so the images can be seen in a sequence. And the full roll consists of 18 roundels, but I'm showing you here only 3, the sequence of roundels 14 through 16. So 14 is the roundel with the rising soul that we just saw in detail. In roundel 15, the news of Guthlac's death reaches his sister. In roundel 16, the body is laid to rest. So each of these roundels is a little less than 7 inches in diameter, or about the size of maybe a salad plate. And if you imagine 3 of them, it sort of spreads out across a space that, is about the size of an altar or a small table. So we can thus imagine an intimate gathering of visitors, more than one person, but perhaps 10 people or so, gathering around and being shown the sequence as a group, and easily observing the parallels between roundel 14 with the departure of the soul and roundel 16 with the burial of the body. And of course, all of this in the context where they have come to visit the relics themselves, but also see the relics for their connection to heaven. Guthlac's body occupies the same position in both roundels 14 and 16, with his body laid out horizontally and his head on the right-hand side of the picture plane. The blankness of the body in the entombment roundel strikes me as especially astonishing. We see the saint rendered as a contour only. Instead of drawing a shroud, the artist has opted to use the blank parchment to reference the dead body and the absence of the soul. The essential point here, however, is the same vertical lines that form the pathway of the soul in roundel 14, leading the soul from the body to heaven. Those vertical lines are still present in this image after the soul has departed and the body has been prepared for burial. So this is an incredible visualization of the idea of the relic, which was understood to maintain a conduit, an open line of contact with heaven, even in the absence of the soul itself. So even though I can't explain the precise function of the Guthlac roll, its format suggests that it was placed directly in conversation with the shrine of the saint. And this is the reason why I want to see it as part of a project on funerary monuments. It mediates interactions between the living and the dead. It shapes how visitors engage with the bodily remains, in this case, the relics of the individual. And crucially, we find the iconography of the rising soul used to emphasize the agency of the corpse. It is not that the body becomes an empty husk after the soul has departed. Rather, what we find is that the soul has opened the path between body and heaven, and this remains open even after the transition to heaven is complete. Through this configuration, the promise of bodily resurrection is not merely a distant idea that belongs at the end of time. It is also part of an active, ongoing set of connections between divine absence and bodily presence. So, as we approach the midpoint of the talk, I'd like to shift back from parchment to stone and to spend the remainder of our time connecting these same ideas to two funerary monuments from the end of the 12th century that are now in the Cathedral of Hildesheim in Lower Saxony. And the first of these is the spectacular monument for Presbyter Bruno, a canon who served as the cellarer of the cathedral from 1181 to 1194. And the monument is very unusually divided into three registers. Bruno's body appears in the bottom register as a corpse, wrapped and shrouded in preparation for burial. The middle register shows the happy soul, hands held up in prayer as two angels carry him aloft to the top register, where we find a bust-length portrait of Christ shown waiting to receive the soul in heaven. And the monument has an unusual shape, similar to a lancet of stained glass, and it was probably once installed upright near the altar of St. Martin in the crypt of the cathedral. It is carved from a single block of limestone, and the pinkish color is probably the result of fire damage, and the surface is fairly weathered. Even so, we can see quite clearly that the composition is divided into registers structured through thick horizontal bands with deep, clearly carved Latin texts. And here we go. The outer edge also has a thick band and a deeply carved inscription, and it is circumscribed by a short poem. To Bruno, whose appearance this stone shows, who gave his property to the poor, give joy, O Christ. So Bruno's role as cellarer meant that he was in charge of organizing provisions for the community, which included not only feeding his fellow priests, but also distributing food and alms to the poor. Thus, the connection between Bruno and acts of charity and giving to the poor should not be read narrowly in a personal biographical sense, but rather as an attribute of office. Of course, it's appealing to imagine that maybe he was also a very generous person and that made him very good at his job. But either way, the couplet sketches the outlines of a spiritual economy that is expected not only of Bruno as an individual, but of the entire community of the canons of Hildesheim. This is a spiritual economy in which Bruno gives to the poor and receives joy from Christ in return. And the text invokes its own materiality. So if you look at the Latin, we're seeing the lapis, or the stone of the monument, and it's used to show Bruno's speciem, his aspect or his appearance. And in German, this is usually translated as Bild, right? The great term for the image or the likeness. The inscription places speciem directly to the left of the image of the rising soul, perhaps hinting that the soul and not the corpse below is the true aspect of the dead canon. But on the other hand, the name Bruno Presbyter appears in the center, on the bar in between body and soul, in between the middle and the bottom registers, as if to signify that the identity of the individual is anchored in both, is the thing that really ties these two things together, body and soul. So we also have inner inscriptions, and the inner inscriptions further elaborate the theme of charity, invoking a series of famous verses from chapter 25 of the Gospel of Matthew. So this begins in the tablet that is held in the hands of Christ. And it's only very short inscriptions, but of course for the canons of the cathedral, these brief texts would have been enough to invoke and really to remind them of the entire passage that I'll read in English. Come, ye blessed of my Father, possess you the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world. For I was hungry and you gave me to eat. I was thirsty and you gave me to drink. I was a stranger and you took me in. Naked and you covered me. Sick and you visited me. I was in prison and you came to me. What you have done to the least of my people, you have done to me. So the verse begins with Christ at the top of the monument, and they continue in the middle text of the inscription. The words are abbreviated, but as I just said, the canons would have known because this was a widely repeated liturgical antiphon. So this is connecting the monument not only to the theme of charity, but more specifically to the liturgy. And the textual references to feeding the hungry and clothing the naked also connect to the placement of the monument near the altar of St. Martin, who is of course explicitly tied to charity as well. And Bruno, we know, was a donor to the altar of St. Martin. The most famous miracle associated with Martin is that he cut his cloak in half to clothe a beggar, only to discover that the beggar was Christ in disguise. And this too, of course, is a direct echo of Matthew 25. Thus, we find the funerary monument behaving not as a narrowly defined monument to Bruno as a singular person, but speaking more broadly to the legacy of St. Martin and the ideal behavior expected of the cathedral canons. And once we see these connections to the text of the Gospels and the context of the altar, we are prepared for the images in the lower register, at least intellectually. But it's difficult to prepare ourselves emotionally for the figures at the very bottom, who reach out to touch the body and reflect different aspects of mourning the dead in unusually poignant terms. So at the upper end near the face, we find two tonsured clerics who seem engaged in anointing the face itself. They cradle the back of Bruno's head, they hold his chin, they pull the shroud across his chest. Others have argued for specific readings of these gestures in connection to the rituals associated with death and burial. But I think the most important thing to consider here is the emotional connections that are forged between the body and the attendants. And this affective dimension is even more significant, I think, when we turn to the other four figures, the lower figures who stand at Bruno's side and curl up at his feet. And these four figures are shown as beggars in tattered clothing. Their presence fits with the themes of charity that are present in the inscriptions, but in their intimate familiarity with the body, they bring the gospel verses to life in unexpected ways. They cling to Bruno's arms and cower at his feet. Their mouths hang open in palpable grief. And the two at the very bottom, a woman on the left and a man on the right, are the most pitiable figures of all. They are literally crumpled up at Bruno's feet, and they weep openly. And it's not just the striking display of emotion that makes these figures so unusual. It is also their visible markers of physical disability. They have hunched backs and atrophied legs, and it's difficult to see at first, but the woman on the left is leaning on a rudimentary crutch. Disabled bodies of any kind are a rarity in medieval sculpture, and when they appear, it is usually in miracle stories where they are imminently about to be healed by Christ. But here, the deformities will remain. This is not a Bible story, but rather a reflection of the communities that Bruno and the canons were serving. Like Bruno's own shrouded corpse, these figures must wait for the end of time before they will be healed. In their present life, they are caught in the humiliation of their bodies, and their presence is a painful reminder that all mortal flesh is doomed to fail sooner or later. So this is an astonishing image of the connections between the living and the dead at the end of the 12th century. And even though the sculpture is badly worn and damaged, enough of the surface survives to glimpse the fine quality of the carving. The contrast between Bruno and the clerics with their smooth faces and elegant robes, and the comparatively scruffy appearance of the other four figures must have been far more striking when the monument was new. Even though Bruno is the dead person who is being mourned, the sculpture itself speaks to a community that includes the privileged and the poor, the able-bodied and the sick, the young and the old, and the living and the dead. And the medieval belief that the flawed mortal body will be resurrected in a perfect form is essential to such images. The same physical matter that was once alive will be reconstituted and remade like a broken piece of pottery that is not replaced or just glued back together, but miraculously fixed of its imperfections. And this was the nature of resurrection in the medieval Christian imagination. And it gives the huddled bodies of the beggars a special power. The monument projects not only the fractured, fragile nature of the corpse and its pitiable state after the death of the individual, but it also reflects on the battered bodies of those who live in poverty, their own yearning for bodily redemption, and the intertwining of donation and salvation. And again, it is images like these that make me reluctant to imagine the Bruno monument as the commission of a single individual for his own hopes of salvation, which is often argued in the literature. The sculpture positions Bruno not as the recipient of the prayers of the living in the manner of later medieval tombs, but rather as a source of salvation, with the most vulnerable members of society huddled at his feet. I also have a very pragmatic reason to doubt that Bruno himself could possibly have commissioned this monument. And it's connected to the specific formulation of the corpse shown standing upright in the tomb. And the depiction of the standing corpse strikes me as closely related to depictions of Lazarus. And so here we've circled back to the Lazarus story, which almost invariably shows Lazarus himself as a wrapped corpse standing in the tomb. And this comparison tightens up considerably when we consult the necrologies of the Cathedral chapter at Hildesheim, where it is recorded that Bruno died in the year 1200 on December 17, which happens to be the feast day of Lazarus. So if we consider that the tomb would have received special commemoration on the anniversary of Bruno's death, it becomes quite compelling to realize that this is also the date when Lazarus himself would have been highlighted in the liturgy. Of course, the iconography of Lazarus was widely established already by the end of the 4th century. I'm returning to the Gospels of Otto III for reference here, but this is, of course, one of dozens or more that I could have cited. I'm particularly struck here by the sisters of Lazarus, Mary and Martha, who are typically shown kneeling at the feet of Christ in the Lazarus story. They offer striking biblical models for the two figures that curl up at Bruno's feet. In the Gospels, it is the sisters of Lazarus who are compelled to believe in the Messiah. It is their pleas that result in the famous miracle that foreshadows not only the resurrection of Christ, but also the hope of resurrection for all. By referencing the Lazarus story through the presentation of the shrouded body and identifying the avatars of poverty that are curled up at his feet with Lazarus' sisters, the monument extends its meaning far beyond the salvation of one person. It speaks to the hopes of redemption for the community as a whole, from the clerics who tend to the ritual closing of Bruno's mouth, all the way to the lowly figures who are kneeling at his feet. The Bruno monument appears at exactly the moment of the 12th century, when the potential for sacred presence was very strong in Hildesheim. The 11th century Bishop Godehard had been canonized in 1131, and his predecessor Bernward of the famous bronze doors became a saint in 1193. Given this background, we can hardly see the saintly overtones of the Bruno monument as a simple plea that someone might pray for his soul. The monument was probably completed only a decade after the raising of Bernward's relics in 1193. And its presentation of broken down bodies that will someday be healed is not unlike the inversion of Bernward's ashes into transcendent relics. This might lead us to ask whether the monument was likewise intended to claim or to promote saintly status for Bruno as well. As the canons of Hildesheim would have known as well as anyone, it could take centuries between the death of an exemplary individual and their eventual elevation to the status of a saint. So it is tempting, with examples like this in mind, to suggest the iconography of the rising soul appears on tomb sculptures, specifically in cases like Bruno, like Hildis, where communities suspected that the body buried below the present tomb might someday be elevated and become the next new local saint. So my last example today is a very unassuming one. So we're going from one of the most elaborate tombs to one of the most simple. It is this rather plain fragment also in Hildesheim, which is all that remains of an effigy for a woman known only as the widow Matilda. It is unfortunately not much to look at. The slab has been cut down from a much larger block. The details have been chipped away. The inscription is weathered and mostly illegible. So just to try to imagine it, in its original state, the fragment would have been similar in scale and format to this tomb effigy from the neighboring diocese of Osnabrück, about 100 miles west. Like the example on the left, the Hildesheim fragment once must have shown an entire body, but all that survives is the head and the shoulders set below a Romanesque arch. Given the rather scruffy condition and the obscure origins of the Matilda fragment, it's not hard to see why it has been almost entirely overlooked and only published in brief catalog entries. But even so, if we look closely, we can find some clues that connect this object to a broader context, and really the context of this talk. The arch over the figure's head still preserves an inscription that reads, "On the 4th day before the calends of February, which is January 29, the widow Matilda died." So this is a very standard formula for funerary inscriptions in this era. It echoes monastic books of memory and calendars that go back to the early Middle Ages. On a pragmatic level, the text ensured that the dead would be commemorated on the anniversary of their death each year. Beyond this, however, such inscriptions also serve the equally important purpose of anchoring the individual in the cyclical time of the world. So the slab is not just the slab of any body or of any woman, but rather a figure that marks the presence of the specific woman who lay buried below, awaiting the promise of eschatological resurrection. The face of the figure was sliced off when the effigy was reused, probably as an architectural block. But the sides of the head have been preserved well enough that we can still recognize a veil that covers the hair, the ears, and the neck. And so this is a common depiction this is a common convention for depicting women modestly in the Middle Ages. It appears in images of married women and also nuns. I should emphasize here that Matilda is far from the first woman to appear in a medieval effigy. But to my knowledge, she does have the distinction of being the first effigy that identifies its subject specifically as a widow. Both of the medieval necrologies from Hildesheim list a widow Matilda who died on January 29 and had donated money to the canons. They specify that 4 silver coins were to be spent on an annual mass in her memory. So this is a woman of some wealth. They don't give a year for her death, which is not unusual. And the name Matilda is common enough in the 12th century that it remains impossible to identify her very precisely. So it's not rare in itself that a woman would be known in her community as a widow in the Middle Ages. But I still find it fascinating that they continue referring to her as a widow on her own funerary monument. So perhaps she'd been widowed for so long that it just didn't occur to anyone to call her anything else. And it's not hard to imagine that the sort of misogynistic cultural habit of defining women by their marital status would persist, even in a funerary context. But it still strikes me as interesting and important to recognize that the monument does not project any sense that she was reunited with her husband in death. And this is again quite relevant to Jessica's work on later material. There's no sense that she was reunited with her husband in death. Quite the contrary, both the monument and the necrology maintain her status as married and yet alone, and they ensure that this is how she was remembered. So even though this is a very simple point, it's something I find very poignant about this monument in general. But even more interesting is that there's one more inscription. 2 more words can be read from the frame of the sculpture, and they're all that remains of what must have been a much longer inscription, probably a poem. We have many other early effigies that survive with framing inscriptions that run all the way around the rectangular slab. They're usually poetry in leonine hexameters, often seem to have been composed specifically for this object, for the object at hand, and not borrowed from other sources, which is something that interests me very much, that they go to the effort of writing unique poems for so many of these early effigies. But in this instance, the text can only be read in the right-hand corner of the surviving frame. And the upper left half of the corner of the upper left half of all the letters have been obliterated. So if you look at the kind of upper right-hand corner, maybe you can make out some lines that are the lower halves of the letters that have survived from 2 words. So it's really not much, but enough of the lower portions of these letters have survived to allow us to reconstruct 2 words. So once we decode these inscriptions, The fragmentary text reads corporis hospes, the guest of the body. And its meaning, unfortunately, has lost all context, given that the rest of the inscription has vanished without a trace. But nevertheless, I would suggest that these two words have quite a lot of power in relation to the discourse of death and dying and commemoration. And further, they carry particular weight when applied to the frame of a figural tomb effigy, a memorial type that focuses attention on the body in all its forms, past and present and future. So corporis hospes, the guest of the body. Given the theme of the paper, you will have already guessed that the guest of the body, corporis hospes, is the soul, that fickle thing that animates and enlivens the human form. The conceit of the soul as the guest of the body derives from a poem attributed to the Roman Emperor Hadrian and recorded in the Historia Augusta. So if the Historia Augusta is to be trusted, which is a big if, we have to imagine the emperor speaking these words on his deathbed in the year 138 of what's now the Common Era. Little soul, you charming little wanderer, my body's guest and partner, where are you off to now? And the phrase appears again in a context much closer to Hildesheim, as it was used on the epitaph of Henry Heinrich, Archbishop of Mainz, who died in 1153 and was buried in Einbeck, which is just 30 miles from Hildesheim. So this tomb no longer survives, but it was recorded in a chronicle from 1596 and included the following inscription: "May the guest of the body go safe and sound to Christ." So even though Henry's epitaph no longer survives, it is impossible to know, given that the epitaph no longer survives, it is impossible to know if it had any figural decorations or not. But I would emphasize here that tomb effigies were still somewhat rare at the end of the 12th century or in the 12th century, and epitaphs without figures were quite common. So my best guess is that the tomb in Mainz probably did not, although we can't really be sure. But still, you know, the fact that we find this inscription in the middle of the 12th century in Mainz, not that far away, it's from he's Archbishop of Mainz. We find it in Einbeck, which is not that far away, tells us that this phrase of the guest of the body seems to have been circulating at this moment. So my interest in trotting out these other examples is not to claim that the Matilda inscription was derived from Hadrian or from Mainz or Einbeck in a narrow sense. But nevertheless, I think it's very important to take seriously the fragment of text and to see it participating in a highly literate and elite intellectual circle, even as the fragment of sculpture is derived from a much larger visual culture that we can only glimpse and never fully reconstruct. And beyond this, the idea that the soul is the guest of the body offers a remarkable inversion of the idea that bodies are merely ephemeral containers for living souls. Rather than focusing on the mortification or putrefaction of the body and putting it in opposition to the soul's eternal triumph, the phrase presents the body at the center, presents the body as the stable and unchanging presence. And it is the soul that is capricious. It is the soul that wanders away. And by suggesting that it is the body that most fully belongs in the world, and it is the soul that is fleeting, the metaphor flies in the face of so many other texts that place emphasis on bodies as transient and illusory. Perhaps most notably the Psalms, for example, which were so central to medieval Christian ritual and to funerary masses in particular. And it is ultimately these tensions that drive my interest in funerary monuments and in images of bodies and souls. We sense the intellectuals and the artists of the 12th century grappling with this question of trying to understand the different ways in which both bodies and souls were ultimately transient. Bodies because of the process of death and decay, but souls because of their return to heaven upon the body's expiration. So if we imagine that the Bruno monument and the Matilda effigy were both carved in Hildesheim at around the same time, we might ask if this soul too was once considered a guest of the body. And it is here that we begin to tease out some differences between these two individuals who lived in the same time and place, but lived very different lives. It is not only that Bruno's monument is more elaborate than Matilda's or more ambitious in its selection of image and text. It also strikes me that the depiction of the soul caught between the corpse and Christ, or caught between the planes of heaven and earth, helps anchor the sanctity of Bruno's body at the bottom and shifts him closer to the status of the saints. And in this aspect, it reminds us again of the ascension of Mary at Autun and the insistence on the reunification of body and soul. Surely the makers of the Autun capital did not see Mary's soul as the guest of the body, given that their composition emphasizes body and soul in the moment of reunification, even as she is being hoisted up to heaven. And I suspect there's a much richer story to be told here, one that points to a fine-grained understanding of how medieval Christians imagine the connections between body and soul. And beyond this, how they understood the connection between the physical and the spiritual aspects of the self, not only in its application to the very special bodies of the saints, but also in relationship to their own anxieties about an uncertain and yet ever approaching future. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sharon. Can you hear me? I'm not sure if Hi, thank you, Sharon. And I'm sorry that my applause will have to substitute for all of the applause that you can't hear over the internet. Thank you for such a visually rich and thought-provoking lecture. That was really wonderful, sort of taking us through new perspectives on more familiar material at Autun and the Guflack role, through to being introduced to monuments that I didn't know anything about, the wonderful tomb of Presbyter Bruno and widow Matilda. It was great to meet both of them. So everybody, the Q&A will work through the chat. So if you can post any questions you have in the chat, and I'll ask them to Sharon, and I'll try to get to as many as possible. I know that some people have been posting in the chat already, but I'm going to take chair's privilege and ask the first question, if that's okay, Sharon. And I thought I might ask a sort of Panofsky-esque question, if that's okay.
Of course.
You kind of, you spoke so interestingly about the kind of tensions and ambiguities in this imagery. And I was just struck by the kind of ambiguity in the sort of direction of these monuments, that by depicting the rising of the soul, you're placing another sort of very particular emphasis on verticality. And yet at least some of these monuments, I know you said the Presbyter Bruno one was maybe always set upright, and I'd like to hear more about that, but at least some of them were set horizontally. So I wondered if you had any thoughts on kind of both how the horizontal placement and also the scale, the fact that these are kind of body-sized and shaped stones on which this iconography is depicted, how that might kind of nuance and problematize our reading of the rising soul on funerary monuments.
Yeah, I mean, thank you so much, Jessica. And it's really wonderful having this conversation with you, because the kind of contrast with your material, I think, is really, really interesting. Kind of what is similar in the 14th, 15th centuries and what is different, right? And one point that I think has always haunted me is that we don't really have early funerary monuments, not really, that survive in situ. We just don't, you know, and so we tend to take what we know of the survivals of maybe the 13th century and kind of project backwards. And so it's very often kind of taken for granted that these things were presented in particular ways. And I've always wanted to push back against that, and to sort of think about the ways in which the monuments themselves kind of nudge us to look at them from particular angles and particular directions. And so, you know, with a lot of this material, I think a lot about the shapes of the monuments and also the placement of the inscriptions. And so with the Hildis, for example, Hildis is really wonderful in that way. It's a trapezoid, and the trapezoid codes it very much as the lid of a sarcophagus, right? Because that's a shape that we encounter very often, very, very often on plain examples that are virtually unmarked, or maybe there's just a cross, and one that goes back quite early. And so the trapezoid, I think, for a 12th century audience would have immediately said, oh, this is a sarcophagus lid. And then you have an inscription that moves you in a circle. And so that one, I really quite like the idea of people walking around it and seeing it from different angles, and even just playing with it on my computer screen. That there's a kind of it looks interesting from different directions. And so the extraction of the soul from the body is more about this kind of relationship to heaven, right? But it's not necessarily upwards, because when you kind of look at it on the side, it's actually quite compelling that way. And part of this too is that is thinking about the kind of 90-degree rotation between the angel and Hildis, which I think is deliberate, because I think they're imagining the monument that you would see on the floor in front of you. Bruno, on the other hand, the inscriptions are all oriented the same direction, right? So they're not moving in a circle. And I think for me with Bruno, the fact that it's the shape of a stained glass window, I mean, that we're so used to seeing that, I think in the Gothic period, we're so used to kind of micro architectural frames that we're sort of used to, and we sort of say, oh yeah. But it's actually, I think, I know in the later period, you have it on the floor all the time with brasses, and you see it all the time because it's everywhere. But I think with this particular monument, it's actually really hard for me to imagine the face of Christ on the floor, right? It's hard for me to imagine like Christ with a slab on the floor at around 1200. And then when you start imagining a crypt and you're underground, and well, you know, the crypt at Hildesheim is a whole other kind of huge topic to think about, and the kinds of reconstructions that people have tried for where it would be placed. I think with that one, it does have a kind of verticality that is also really interesting, thinking about it in relationship to the altar. You know, that whether I mean, I almost think of it as not, it's not heretical, right? But thinking of the ways in which altars tend to have things on the walls around them, and this would fit very naturally there. So, and then the other thing about scale is that, you know, with Hildis, the inscription suggests that she was a child. I referred to her as a woman in this talk, but it's actually quite ambiguous, you know. And so one thing that's really interesting is that the slab is the size of a kind of typical sarcophagus, but because the frame is quite large and the angel takes up a good amount of space, it's actually interesting that the scale of her body is the scale of a child, maybe 12 years old, 10 years old, something like that. And so that's something I think about a lot. But with Bruno, I think part of the reason why I want to see it on the wall and not over the body is exactly because the effigy-like part, the corpse, is quite small. Right? It doesn't, as opposed to so many other effigies in this period that project the scale of the body, these two I think are very interesting because they don't, you know, whether one of them is small because she's a child, and whether the other one is small because they're thinking of it anyway as a relief on the wall. And so there's no need for it to be a projection of the size of the corpse in the way that it might if it were a sarcophagus lid. So But again, I mean, that's part of what I really enjoy about these monuments is that we've lost archaeological context. We just have the sculptures themselves. And so it is kind of speculation that's driven by looking at the logic of the carver and kind of thinking, well, what would make sense and what would drive these decisions? And I think that's endlessly fascinating.
Thanks, Sharon. It's just great to kind of think about what we can learn through just looking really closely, and your lecture was such a brilliant exposition of that approach. It just struck me while you were talking, and I will stop hogging you in a second, that one of the really interesting things about that Bruno memorial is that the logic of the inscription reads in the opposite direction to the rising of his soul. So you kind of read it down and then upwards again, or upwards then down. So I've got lots of
yeah, if I could just respond to that for one moment.
Yeah, of course, sorry.
What's really interesting, and I kind of worked this out years ago and I need to look at it again, but there's, with the Bruno, you know, that text from Matthew 25, there's two quotations. And if you read the top inscription first and then the bottom inscription, you're going in the order of the Gospels. But if you read the bottom to top, you're going in the order of the liturgical antiphons. So I actually think that there is a kind of funny play with what's happening down, but I can't point to other examples in around 1200 where they're actually doing this, where they're actually playing.
That's fascinating.
But it's something I think about a lot.
Wow, it's such an amazing monument. I'd never, wow. Okay, so I'm going to go to our questions in the chat. So we have our first question from Tabitha, who asks, what relation do you see to these medieval ways of dealing with and representing the body and soul, and how we, sorry, I read that a little bit in a bit of a confused way. So what relations do you see to these medieval ways of dealing with and representing the body and the soul and death, and how we do it in our world today?
I mean, it's such a great question, because I think it's really funny, because I'm going to end up talking about Jessica's book the whole time, and I'm thinking about the way the title of your book from the Philip Larkin poem, and so I'm just trying to keep pushing this back onto Jessica. But I think it is what pulls so many of us to the Middle Ages, is that there are moments where it feels so familiar and so, relatable, for lack of a better word, and then you keep reading or you keep looking, and then there's something else that is just so utterly alien to how we think. And I think that kind of constant, it kind of keeps you on your toes, right? That it's not so distant, and yet it's not close either. And so it's really hard, I think, to generalize about connections, precisely because, first of all, we live in a very large, complicated world, and this is very much a talk about medieval Christianity. Even if we stay within Christianity and kind of leave out all the many other people, faith systems around us, Christianity is also very complicated, right? I mean, there's just so many different approaches. And I think one of the things about this material that interests me so much is that their expressions about death and the afterlife and the hope of resurrection is so literal. And I think that growing up in the United States, at least, there is a kind of popular culture in which it's all metaphorical, or if not metaphorical, then kind of metaphysical. Like it's kind of, that we imagine a kind of, I'm thinking of like recent Disney movies that have imagined the afterlife as kind of, glowing spheres and kind of moving towards the light. And I mean, and then again, Disney movies are interesting in that way because they speak to such broad audiences. And so I think that this kind of medieval insistence on the kind of physical reality, I think, is interesting to me, because it is so different, and it's sort of things that we associate with kind of a kind of naivete, but it's not naive in the Middle Ages. It's them trying to work out a kind of theological reality, and I'm thinking of Caroline Walker Bynum's work here. I mean, her book on the resurrection of the body, and when you read these kind of early medieval texts about resurrection, they are so literal, and I think that lingers. I think that lasts for quite a long time, and it's really only rather recently that we've shifted towards a much looser and more intuitive approach to how we think about the afterlife.
Thanks, Sharon. I'm just trying to pick the questions out from the litany of praise and thanks. So hopefully we can provide you with a transcript of all of the praise and thanks after the lecture, because I would like you to receive it. But the next question we have is from Jane. And Jane says, thank you, excellent presentation. But she wanted to ask in particular about your use of the word anxiety, and also the distinction you draw between private and communal. She wondered about the kind of meaning of those terms in your period, considering in post-Freudian days it has a quite specific meaning.
Yeah, no, thank you. I think both of those concepts, the concept of anxiety and also the kind of concept of individual and personal, I think, in both cases, there's sort of a massive body of literature on this that I find extremely interesting and compelling. And I like that they, we were just talking a moment ago about resurrection and about the difference between the kind of literal resurrection of, when I am resurrected, will my fingernails be the same as they are right now, right? Versus a kind of loose, intuitive, like, oh, something will happen and it's good, right? And I think that with these concepts as well, right, that there's a kind of a very literal experience of anxiety. And then there's anxiety as kind of a loose general term. And I think that it's important to think about both, right? That I think that a kind of, and this is again, I mean, this is, I'm thinking the last question and kind of the ways in which we relate our own lived experiences as humans with trying to understand the experiences of people who lived in medieval Europe. That I think that with anxiety, I think it's a fundamental kind of human thread to worry about the future. And we find it, wherever you find, literature, you find authors and poets kind of worrying about what the future might hold because we don't know. And whether that's the future in a very mundane sense or whether that's life after death. I mean, I'm thinking about, Gilgamesh. I mean, I don't want to say that it's the same everywhere because it's surely not. But I think that this kind of worry about what happens when we die is something that is just profoundly human and something that makes us very different from what we know of how animals, for example, experience the world, that we have a kind of fear of what comes next. But that's the side of me that relates to it on a kind of human level. But then there's the actual research that goes into this, right? And we find so much in the art and also in the theology of the time of a kind of very real warning about resurrection, a very real warning about the end of time. And so, with connecting the talk to something like Otan, for example, and I kind of threw out a line about, we're all thinking about Giselbertus, right? We're talking about, sculptures that are part of the golden age. For art historians, it's a golden age. For medieval people, I don't know. But the moment when these Last Judgment images are very prominent, right? The moment when you could go from town to town in Burgundy and all of these workshops are producing massive, monumental images of the Last Judgment, right? And so whether it's anxiety and the kind of existential, like I am worried about my fate, or whether it's, this is part of a visual culture that is bombarding people with images of the Last Judgment, right? And it's important, I think your question is really important for thinking about knowing that we're on thin ice here, because even with these Last Judgment images, it's very hard to look at the Last Judgment imagery that you find in your classic 12th century churches and to actually ask yourself, did medieval people experience this with actual fear? Did it actually frighten them? Or was it a little bit more like how we might experience, a horror movie where it gives you that moment of raising your pulse, but you also know that you're going to go home and sleep in your own bed, and that Jack the Ripper or whoever, well, Jack the Ripper is an interesting historical example, but that these stories, these scary stories that we tell ourselves, that we tell one another, whether they're completely fictional or whether they have a kind of grain of truth and reality, but you see what I'm saying, right? That whether it's actually giving you nightmares or not, to go to a scary movie is different from person to person in our world. Whether images of the Last Judgment on monumental sculptures actually terrified medieval people, or if it was just a way of getting their attention when they came to church, I think that's very difficult to know. And I think it's that slippage of what we don't know that makes it interesting. And just to end, this point about private and individual, I mean, that really is, and again, Caroline Walker Bynum, I've already mentioned, Susan Kramer, Colin Morris, there's a whole body of literature about the idea of the individual in the 12th century. And so there I'm sort of tapping into a scholarly debate that's older than I am, and profound and very interesting. It's true that in the 12th century, we start finding in Europe more and more individual people who are documented. And the question becomes, is that because the 12th century has a kind of, do they place a greater cultural value on the idea of the individual person? Or is it that individuals, as I really argued for Bruno, for example, that individuals are being held up as exemplars or ideals, or that you sort of you pick your star of your community, and they are an individual, but they are also a representative, literally a representative of the aspirations of the whole group, right? And that's why I think the contrast and the overlap between Bruno and Matilda is very interesting, right? Because Bruno's membership in the community of canons is very different from Matilda's isolation as a woman whose husband has died and who's just donating on her own. And I think that difference plays out, whether or not it played out in their daily lives, it plays out in how their monuments are imagined and how people are remembering them after they've died. And I find that very poignant, to think that they might have known one another, but that they lived very, very separate lives in this 12th century town in the middle of what's now Germany.
Thank you, Sharon. We got two questions that sort of extend both threads of your answer that you've just given. One is about the relationship between monuments with rising soul, iconography, and social rank. But is there a pattern in the kinds of people that have soul iconography on their monuments? And the other one is about, what are the differences in the depiction of souls on their way to hell as compared to those on their way to heaven?
Those are both really great questions. And those are both questions that I think need a much more, and this is what I want to do, is to do a much more systematic examination of the evidence, because I sort of have my favorite monuments and a kind of growing list of monuments that show this iconography in interesting ways. And yet they are so, there are many, many more that I haven't looked at yet. And I think it's sort of circular that I started working on this project in 2019, early 2020, and I have a kind of long list of examples that I'd like to go look at. And I think as soon as I start doing more research travel, I'm going to encounter more and more of them. So this is a project that's basically poised for research travel that I haven't done in the past 2 years, and I hope to be able to do soon, for reasons that we all know all too well. In terms of rank, my instinct and my kind of intuition here is that you see it most often with churchmen. Jessica and I were just talking about a really beautiful example at Ely that was, so bishops, priests, kind of, men of the cloth. And it's probably, as I was suggesting, it probably is related to saints and canonization. Hildis is very unusual. It's very unusual that you find it for the tomb of a girl who is otherwise unknown. And I've written a lot about Hildis in other contexts, and so I kind of went through it quickly today because if you type my name into JSTOR, you will find many things I have written about Hildis. But I think with Hildis, it really is that they were hoping that she'd become a saint. And so who is on deck to become a saint in the Middle Ages, and who do we imagine are people who are going to become saintly? And it tends to be in this period people who are already associated closely with the church, or people who die under dramatic circumstances. Hildis is murdered, and it's worth saying, I'm sure this will be familiar to many of you, she's murdered probably within a few years, or her monument at least is made within a few years of when Becket is murdered. And of course, we have very dramatic images of the rising soul of Becket. And there's a few really wonderful ones already in the 1170s, which is about the date of Hildis's tomb. And so Becket is also really interesting there, because the shocking manner of his death is what makes everybody want to imagine the kind of experience of the rising soul. And at the same time, Becket is a very, Thomas Becket is a very interesting example of somebody who the shocking manner of his death means that everybody, I think, again, there's many people here who probably know more about Becket than I do, but who somebody that you could anticipate him becoming a saint, right? Somebody whose manner of death means, okay, he's going to become saintly, right? So I think ultimately it does come back to the cult of saints. But what interests me so much about funerary monuments is that they occupy this kind of place in between, and that a lot of the scholarship tends to imagine the saints as a separate category from ordinary people. And actually in the Middle Ages, those aren't very separate, because this is what I was trying to say, is that actually you could look at members of your community and kind of hope that someone's going to hear your petition, and they're compiling canonization dossiers. You have to lobby for a member of your community to become a saint. And so then you start imagining these monuments not as static things that are meant to be forever, but quite possibly as placeholders for this awkward moment in between when they die and when they become recognized as saints. And if you're a member of that community, you very much hope that this person will become the saint, even though obviously in Bruno's case and Ryan Hildis's case, it never happened, which is probably why the funerary monument survives and we don't have a reliquary. The other question about souls going to hell, that points to another whole aspect of this project, which is that I have started from a position of being very interested in specific monuments that are hooked to specific bodies. So there's a funerary monument for a dead body. There is a reliquary that contains particular relics, right? And the instances of these iconographies in places where we find it connected to a singular individual. There's a whole other category of the kind of generalized, right? And this is where, staying with heaven for a moment, the cloth of souls, the bosom of Abraham, is a whole other iconography where it's just kind of like the souls of everybody. And I'm thinking of some wonderful late medieval, I'm thinking of a great English alabaster that's now in Boston, but there's many, many more examples where you can look at the kind of cloth of souls and, oh, there's a king, there's a bishop, there's a woman, there's a nun, there's a regular person, whatever, there's just a guy, there's a monk. And those are very interesting because this goes back to the individual versus the collective. Those are just purely collective identities. As you can imagine, all the examples I know of souls going to hell are collective in that sense, although I have to stop and think about this. I mean, you've got kind of the story of Lazarus and Dives, the rich man and the poor man, and who goes to heaven and who goes to hell. But those are biblical figures, not people whose relics or whose bodies you have. Lazarus at Otan is a funny in-between place where he's a biblical figure, but they believe that they have his body, right? They believe that they have his relic. But Lazarus and Dives, I don't think you have that. So in my mind, I think that I haven't encountered the soul going to hell because you wouldn't put that on someone's monument necessarily, at least not in this period. But it's a really interesting question. And it points to the other question that I really do need to think about. And that ties back to the individual and the collective, right? And where is the iconography of the rising soul, or perhaps the descending soul, if it's a soul in hell, going to hell? Where is it attached to a person whose bodily remains are in this locale and associated with this object? And where is it a generalized warning to everyone? And this, of course, goes back to like Last Judgment imagery and things like that. So yeah, it's a great question. And I hope that kind of takes you through at least what I'm thinking about it. But I will keep thinking because it's really important.
I've got a question from Tom here. He says, thank you for a wonderful talk. And he asks, do you think the relationship between representations of the soul and the body on these monuments is related to that between representations of the body in the effigy and the corpse? Or should we think more about corpse, effigy, soul as a three-part structure?
Can you read that again so I can think this through?
There were some important brackets there that were difficult to communicate. Tom, maybe it would be better if you asked live.
Yeah, sorry, I'll say I don't think I articulated it very clearly in that. It's really to ask you where the corpse lies in your argument, because it seems to me there's a kind of interesting relationship between the image of the soul and the effigy, and then the corpse kind of sits as a kind of third part of that, but there's also a relationship between the effigy and and the corpse. And as you can tell, I haven't quite kind of figured this out myself, but where does the corpse sit in your argument is really my question.
Yeah, that's a lovely question. And I was just sort of thinking through the kind of the way you phrased it, I thought was actually really interesting because it was so structural. I was sort of thinking through the different pieces. And I think this takes me back a little bit to Jessica's question at the beginning, because we don't know, because the archaeological record is so muddled, right? And so it's something that it's something where I think that, I mean, this is something I kind of wrestled with, you know, in the book that Jessica held up at the start here, is that in studies of funerary monuments, there tends to be this presumption that the body and the corpse and the effigy or the sculpture or the monument were necessarily together. And I'm not quite sure if that's the case or not. And the example that kind of haunts me, that I hope will be familiar to people, and many people in the audience, is the Durandus of Mwasak. Right, so this is the one that, like, I talk about this a lot because it bothers me so much. So you have this beautiful cloister at Mwasak in southwestern France, and you have a rectangular marble slab with an image of Abbot Durandus, and he's up against the wall. And one of my kind of favorite little lines to throw out there, I think it made it into the book, is that, you know, if the cloister had been dismantled, let's say in the French Revolution, and, you know, Lenoir had taken it to Paris as a sculpture, and we lacked archaeological or architectural context, then people would have imagined that marble slab was originally over Durandus's tomb. There's no reason why not, right? It looks so much, I mean, it's a rectangle, it has the body, it has the inscription, it has the name. It looks like a funerary monument, but because the architectural context, as far as we know, seems to be intact, nobody connects, or very few people kind of actually think of it as funerary. It's rather commemorative, right? And you know, and I've always kind of had this thought in the back of my head of, like, maybe someday a French archaeologist will pull it off the wall and we'll find the body behind the marble. I mean, it's possible, like, you know, and we do have in that cloister, if you take a left and walk down 10 paces, there's a capital that has a reliquary cavity that would have had a relic in it. So that already kind of introduces, you know, physical bodily remains into the space of that cloister, and burial in cloisters is a thing that happens. And so where was he buried? And again, it's, you know, there are sources from Mwasak that help us with these questions, but there's always also this element of uncertainty. And that becomes exponentially more difficult when you think of all of the cases where the objects have lost their bodies long ago, right? And so, you know, I think you know, probably not everybody agrees with me, but I think that a lot of the examples in my book, that the body might well have been somewhere else. That when you go to Quedlinburg, for example, there are lead caskets that contain bodily remains that survive in the crypt at Quedlinburg in Eastern Germany. And I don't know that the famous effigies of the abbesses were necessarily in front of these lead caskets. It's entirely possible that you divorce these things, and that the corpse or the casket or the body is within the liturgical space of the church somewhere, but maybe not within 6 inches of the sculpture, right? So that's all to say that you know, I love your question, and I love the scholarship on this question that comes out of the late Middle Ages, because, you know, again, pointing to Jessica, we have so much more context, you know, we have so much more evidence that we're on firmer ground, because once you get to the 15th, 16th centuries, 14th, and 15th centuries, I would say, although, you know, Jessica might qualify that further, but you have more examples where we look at them and we think, okay, I am fairly confident that I know where this person is buried. All of the examples that I tend to work on, there's actually quite a lot of uncertainty, right? And so, you know, so I think, you know, then you start getting into the language of, you know, I do think effigies were meant to make you think of the body, right? And I like to think that they made you think of a body that was quite proximate, you know, that you're seeing this body and that you're imagining, you know, the skeleton on the other side of the slab. But I don't know that, I'm not sure. And I think that there are examples like Durandus out there where, you know, he's buried somewhere at the monastery, but not there immediately. So Tom, I'm going on and on. I don't know if that answers your question very well, but it's something I really like to think about, because it does get kind of muddled very quickly.
Thank you. Yeah, I think it does. I guess what I was trying to say is, in a way, showing the soul calls attention to the representational status of the effigy. It's not the body. These are both removed from the soul, and the effigy are removed from the corpse. But anyway, there are other questions.
No, I think that's a really wonderful formulation. I'm going to write that down in a moment, because that's really, really helpful. And it's exactly that of especially because, and of course, another whole category that I didn't even touch are, when do you see the soul represented as a dove? But I think in the ones that are in reference to a body that is in the institution, you don't tend to get the soul as a dove, you tend to get it as a body. And then immediately, the soul shown as a body and the body shown as a body, that gets at that tension that you're invoking quite well, I think.
I was just going to ask, jumping off of Tom's question, how far you find it made me think of the kind of rhetoric you find on late medieval tombs, which is, under this stone, this body lies. Do you ever find that rhetoric on monumental inscriptions in your period? I mean,
this is why the Bruno inscription is interesting, because it's one of the ones that does that, right? So Bruno, who's aspect, appearance is shown, and it references the stone, and it references his appearance, but I mean, and again, the corporis hospes in the Matilda one, I think is also interesting, because it's the guest of the body, but the body gets mentioned, right? But that's something I'd like to look through, I think, much more systematically. And you have it, Rudolf Rheinfelden, the Duke of Swabia, buried at Mersenberg Cathedral, often cited as the first, although we don't really know, but possibly the first effigy. That's an inscription that says, he is buried here, right? But I think the fact that I find it sometimes then makes me think, it's like when they're mentioning it and they're insisting on it, then that tells you that that's not always the case. And so I think it's the ones where you don't have that inscription, where it doesn't say, buried in this tomb, right? So we do have it quite early, but it's not that frequent. And then it to me, it kind of opens the door for all of the other ones to then have possibly to have a looser relationship between the monument and the site of burial than we often presume.
Thanks, Sharon. We've got more questions than we're going to have time to ask. So I'm just going to ask kind of one last one, but I want to, we'll make sure that you have a transcript of this chat with your thanks and all the questions that people asked. And I'm sorry to anyone who didn't get their question asked. So this last one is from David. And he says, I enjoyed that a lot, thank you. Surely the predecessors of vertical panels like those on the Bruno monument ought to be the tiers of vertical figures on early cross shafts. Monuments like that at Church Kello present tiers of scenes that relate to each other in a similar way to those you suggest at Hildesheim.
That's a really good point. And I think that's one of the nice things about giving this talk for an audience that's mostly in the UK, right? But I think it's a really, really good point. And I'd have to think about it more. To my mind, I can't immediately think of a place where we have, this is just to say, the cross shafts that come to my mind and the 12th century funerary monuments that come to my mind are in different places. So what's in, the British Isles and what's in central Germany, right? But I haven't looked at it systematically. And so I think it's just a really, really good comment and really worth thinking about. And yeah, I mean, absolutely, the fact that this is all happening against, I mean, this is one of my kind of, constant sort of things to think about is genre. And as art historians, one of our kind of tasks is to think through genres and to have kind of taxonomies and to think of different types of monuments. But then very often we end up putting ourselves in little boxes of, I think about this kind of monument and not that kind of monument, and so for my talk today, I really wanted to bring in some manuscript material because I think that's one where what that manuscript object tells us about the kind of experience of visiting the dead, I think is really interesting. Same thing for, the kind of the crucifixes and the crosses and the kind of Christological imagery. tends to be separated out. But you're right, with Bruno, one of the most interesting things about Bruno that I didn't really talk about is that you have Christ at the top, right? And in this early period, you have it more frequently later on, but in this early period, to be showing Christ and the dead body on the same monument, on the same slab, it is really interesting. And I do think that I should, think more about crosses and the different forms of kind of Christological monuments that speak to these same issues, but they do it obviously with a very, very different type of body and one that is sort of everywhere and nowhere in the Middle Ages.
Thank you, Sharon. And I think this is a point to thank you again for such generous answers to all of our questions and such a rich and thought-provoking talk. Like I said, I wish you could hear actual applause, but we'll make sure that you receive the transcript of all your applause and thanks. Thank you everyone for attending Sharon's lecture. Quite a few of you have asked for more details of Sharon's publications. I reassure you that she's highly Googleable. So if you Google Sharon Fozzie at Pittsburgh or Sharon Fozzie on academia, you will find Sharon's work where she talks about some of the monuments she mentioned today, and of course her book. So do Google her. You will find things. I'll see you all, some of you, at the Medieval Postgraduate Colloquium or the ICMA lecture or our next work in progress. So thank you, Sharon.
Thank you, Jessica. Thanks, everyone.